is always talking about Meng Wanzhou, right?
It's
She's
true.
like our number one topic because crazy things keep happening with her. Matt, why don't you give us an update about Canada and Meng Wanzhou and tell us what's going on there?
Sure. Okay, I'll call this one the Meng Minute because I think that's how you pronounce it. It's not Ming, it's Meng, something like that. But it's going to be a little bit more than a minute because, Dan, it's been a crazy week,
Oh, yeah?
especially in Canada and what's been going on. So, let's see. Let's start with some of the charges that have been officially laid. So, the United States government has officially laid 13 charges, and they have also officially sent those charges to Canada to start the extradition process. So, acting U.S. Attorney General Matthew Whitaker stated these things. So, 13 counts of bank and wire fraud that
Oh,
relates to the subsidiary of Huawei called Skycom that was operating in Iran. And we already knew Skycom was involved. What's interesting, though, is some of the details that's come out of this. So, of course, Huawei responded to the U.S. Acting general attorney, and they said Skycom and Huawei are unrelated. They said this has nothing to do with Huawei, and so of course they're denying everything. Now there's interesting things that came out of this. So not only are they claiming that Huawei broke United States laws, but they're saying the International Emergency Economic Powers Act was broken and that they were committing money laundering.
oh,
Yeah, so those are the charges. And also, there is a secondary charge um, with stealing trade secrets. So this is one that was new. We didn't know about this until it was submitted. And they're basically claiming that Huawei tried to steal robotic technology from T-Mobile to test smartphone durability. So somehow somebody in Huawei had access to these robots, and that they were copying the technology and doing a little bit of um, espionage, I guess, to steal that technology. So that was officially sent out, and of course Huawei said no, we completely deny everything. And also this week, the Canadian ambassador to China, his name's John Malcolm, got fired, or actually
oh.
asked to resign.
I was gonna
And
say, can you be fired from that?
I think you can, but you can also ask for somebody's resignation if they're a high profile individual. And here's what happened. So it's basically like every day of the week, there was more drama with this guy. So Tuesday, January 22nd, John Malcolm was talking to Chinese journalists, and he said, I think Meng Wanzhou has a really good case. And then he gave some advice on what they should do to win their court case. So, first of all, here's a guy that represents a country that has arrested her, and he's giving her defense attorneys advice,
That's
right? Like,
insane.
yeah, this is not right, right? He's definitely talking a very different story from what the Canadian government is saying. So that was Tuesday. Then Wednesday, the very next day, of course, many people in the Canadian government were like, hey, this is completely wrong. It's out of line. You should fire this guy. And Trudeau was like, no, 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 it's okay. He must have misspoke. Thursday, John Malcolm gets on the air and he says, I'm sorry, I misspoke. People were taking my comments wrong. I don't know how you can take those comments wrong, but that's kind of what he stated. And then Friday, he was sitting in front of a Canadian reporter, and he once again restated a lot of these things that he said he misspoke on. So he said, "Oh, it would be great for Canada if the U.S. dropped their extradition request," and he went off on how this isn't right, is the way he put it. So he was definitely speaking the Chinese playbook. He was not talking the Canadian stance, which is a an ally has requested extradition, and it's a process, due process, according to Canadian and international law. And he was talking about how it was all political. And anyways, basically, that was after that one that Prime Minister Trudeau called him up and requested his resignation.
Oh, that's interesting. And am I right in the fact that you don't like Trudeau very much as a prime minister, Matt?
Well, I'm probably not as angry at him as most of Western Canada is. But anyways, in this case, I think Trudeau did wait too long to act. I think he definitely needed to rein in his ambassador to China. And it's interesting. I've read some political commentary where they say, hey, this is what China does with officials, so ambassadors. They bring them into China and they try to win them over to the Chinese way of things. And so then these ambassadors, they feel like they're special and they have access to these Communist Party leaders, which is what they should have in the first place because they're ambassadors. And anyways, they start to see themselves as the Chinese government instead of as the Canadian government. So anyways,
a little bit
lots of people
manipulative.
said, yeah, he was compromised and he had to go. So
Crazy.
anyways, interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. One of the other things that you brought up that I find interesting is that they were charged with money laundering internationally.
Yes.
It's so interesting that people can launder money, drug runners can launder money, and cell phone companies can.
Yeah.
What?
Well, it comes back to those charges, those fraud charges. So Skycom, which according to these documents is a subsidiary of Huawei, was using money that Huawei had lined up and funneled it to Skycom. And these banks, these are American banks, lent money to Huawei for Huawei's business, not for business in Iran, which would be breaking American law as well as international law because it was money laundering. They were laundering American dollars through Skycom to Iran.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. So what's all the hype and concern about Huawei?
Okay, so that's a great question. So we've touched this a little bit in the past, like why is everybody concerned about it and why is this such a big deal? And a lot of people out there are saying, look, and I think this is probably the most proper concern. Like I don't think there's anything wrong with having this thought pattern, but then we'll go through why I think it's more than this. And the argument is this is just the United States trying to push out a competitor. So China's competitive. The United States is the biggest economy in the world. China was rapidly growing and still is. And the United States has a lot of these telecommunication companies, and they would rather have American telecommunication companies become stronger. And so they see this as a competitive economics battle. And I'm sure that's the Chinese way of looking at it too. And so that's one argument. However, when you actually get down into the individual details, it really does look like where there's smoke, there's fire. And in this case, it is concerning to many people. So the first thing that was brought up in these charges is, number one, Huawei's ties to the Chinese government. So we've got to remember that this is not like an American or a European or a free world company which acts on its behalf, has to work within the law like we're used to. But this is actually a company that is in communist China. And communism, they own those companies. Now, you could say, well, the new Chinese economy really is trying to separate the government from these companies, but let's not kid ourselves. This is still a government that owns just about everything that's coming out of their country. So when people are concerned about the Chinese government then going to Huawei and saying, okay, you have all the infrastructure of these 5G networks in the United States. We want you to turn them off, or we want you to spy, or we want you to do something that can disrupt. We want you to steal technology, information, right? These are the types of concerns that they have.
Oh, that's really fascinating.
And
yeah,
there have been Chinese companies that have been caught, right? So here's the other problem. It's not a this could happen. It's a this has happened. And so it's happened on a smaller scale. Do we want to take the risk on a larger scale? So here's some of the things that they can do. This is one of the concerns. Chinese tech companies could be compelled by the Chinese government to modify their technology for spying.
But they did
And
say that they don't, right? Like I remember we
sure,
talked a few podcasts ago where they came out in a statement and said,
we don't.
we don't. Yeah.
And maybe they don't, but it doesn't mean they couldn't be asked to.
Right.
Right, and that's a concern, and maybe it's just like, to me it was pretty obvious that those Russian spies that we reported on were Russian spies, and the Russian government says we don't know who these people are, even though they were high-level Russian spies and identified as high-level Russian spies, right? Like, do you really trust them? So this is what the U.S. Department said this week. The immense influence that the Chinese government holds over Chinese corporations is a threat to America's economic and national security. So that's a quote from these documents. So what kind of modifications can they make? There's the attacking the supply chain, and this is where the producer makes a change to either the software or the hardware before it actually gets to the end user. So if the United States or the Canadian government put in an order, and they might even inspect all the equipment that they're going to buy. So these routers, these antennas, the networks, they can inspect it and say, okay, there's no spyware, it can't happen. Well, this stuff isn't made yet that's going to be installed and put in place. Are they going to inspect every router? Are they going to inspect every antenna, every node? And with 5G, these nodes are going to be all over the place because that's the nature of 5G. It has to be close together. So, that's what they're mostly worried about. And in the past, according to Bloomberg, now a lot of this still has to be proven, but Bloomberg Business Magazine reported earlier last year that computer components from a company called Supermicro had been subtly modified during manufacturing in a Chinese factory.
Whoa.
And Apple and Amazon both use those chips. So, you could argue, well, that hasn't been proven, but it also hasn't been proven that it didn't happen. And China has been caught with their hands in the cookie jar. Just in December, 2 Chinese agents, so not rogue people, actual Chinese agents working for the Chinese government, were caught stealing from 12 countries, of which the United States and Canada were part of. And this is a quote also from the United States documents. We are talking about state-sponsored actors engaged in illegal behavior. So
that's interesting.
That's where the concerns are coming from. So it's not this could happen, it's this has happened, and do we want to take the risk with such a huge infrastructure project like this?
Wow. Yeah. Okay. I can see why you're concerned.
So what do you think, Dan? Or do you think that this is much ado about nothing? Do you think, and I also see the other side of things. This could be the United States government protecting American companies that could also be installing the same equipment. And Huawei is cheaper. In fact, they're hugely integrated into Canada's 4G and 3G networks. Hugely integrated. In fact, if Canada decided not to use them for 5G, the interacting between the old Huawei equipment and the new whoever installs it is going to take a lot of work.
Oh, no. Well, I think you can look at it 2 ways. We might be just being a little bit too paranoid, Like, have you ever seen the original Batman movie where if they used shampoo and soap together, it would make them go crazy? Do you remember that one?
No, I don't
anyway.
remember that.
It just reminds me of that where it's like, these big corporations are out to get you. I don't know. Maybe they're not. Maybe it's just a cheaper solution and we're overreacting.
Maybe. But on the other hand, would you rather overreact and be safe or say, oh, I'm just overreacting, and then all of a sudden your 5G network shut down or trade secrets are stolen or, right? Like, would you rather err on the side of caution and maybe be considered paranoid? Or would you rather try to be open and trusting and then be taken for a ride?
Well, I'd like to actually create more Canadian and American jobs, by using American companies for this 5G network. So I could see a political benefit of doing that, but I don't know. Sometimes the cheapest person wins.
Well, in this case, Huawei is the cheapest person, and that's probably part of the concern.